cross-posting from another podcast in our network, Seeds of History. Happy Thanksgiving, everyone. Hey there, history enthusiasts. Welcome back to Seeds of History, where we dig up the past, dust it off, and plant it firmly in your brain, whether it likes it or not. I'm your host, Bennett Tanton, and today we're going to take a journey into the myths, legends, and inconvenient truths surrounding one of America's most celebrated holidays, Thanksgiving. You've heard the story a million times, right? Pilgrims in funny hats, Native Americans with feathered headdresses, and a picture-perfect feast that looks like something out of a Norman Rockwell painting. It's a cozy narrative, one that makes you feel all warm and fuzzy inside, just in time for a second helping of pie. But let me tell you, the real story, not quite so picture-perfect. It's a tale of survival, cultural clashes, political maneuvering, and yes, uneasy alliances that would eventually unravel in ways most people never learn about. Today, we're going to dive deep into the historical stew pot to separate the turkey from the stuffing, so to speak. We'll explore what really went down between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag people, how this famous feast became mythologized, and why the truth of Thanksgiving offers a much richer and sobering reflection of American history than you might expect. Before we dig in, though, let me ask for a little Thanksgiving favor. If you enjoy Seeds of History, take a moment to like, share, and review the podcast. Trust me, your support is like the cranberry sauce that holds this whole operation together. Sweet, tart, and absolutely essential. Now grab a plate and let's feast on the facts. Let's start by addressing the elephant, or should I say the turkey, in the room. Where does the Thanksgiving story we all know come from? You know, the one with the Pilgrims and Native Americans sitting down together, passing the mashed potatoes and sharing a hearty laugh over pumpkin pie. Spoiler alert, this version of events is about as historically accurate as your aunt's recipe for healthy green bean casserole. The truth is, the image of the first Thanksgiving wasn't cemented in our national consciousness until the 19th century. Yes, you heard that right. Nearly 200 years after the supposed event, Americans finally decided to make it a thing. So why the delay, and why the sugarcoating? Well, the answers have everything to do with a little national identity crisis we were having back in the mid-1800s. Enter Sarah Josepha Hale, a name you've probably never heard, but one you owe a big thanks for making Thanksgiving a household word. Hale, a magazine editor, abolitionist, and the author of Mary Had a Little Lamb, yes, that Mary, spent decades campaigning for a national Thanksgiving holiday. She saw it as a way to unite a country divided by regional differences and eventually the looming Civil War. Hale was less interested in historical accuracy and more in creating a warm, fuzzy origin story that could bring Americans together around a shared meal. And hey, can you blame her? Nothing says unity like turkey and stuffing, right? It worked. In 1863, President Abraham Lincoln declared Thanksgiving a national holiday, and the narrative of Pilgrims and Native Americans breaking bread together was solidified in our cultural memory. But here's the kicker. The actual feast at Plymouth in 1621, it wasn't even called Thanksgiving. The Pilgrims saw it as a harvest celebration, something they already knew how to do from their time back in England. The Native Americans who joined them, the Wampanoag, probably didn't realize they were participating in what would later become a cornerstone of American mythology. And let's not forget how artists like Jean Leon Jerome Ferris in the early 20th century really ran with this idea, painting those idyllic scenes of smiling pilgrims and cooperative Native Americans. Those images became shorthand for a simpler, more sanitized version of history, a narrative that erased the messy, complicated realities of colonialism, survival, and cultural collision. So, why does this myth endure? It's simple. We like it. It's comforting, and it gives us a holiday we can celebrate without too much cognitive dissonance. But if we're going to honor history, we need to peel back the layers of this story and ask the tough questions. Who were the real players? What were their motivations? And what does the true story of Thanksgiving tell us about America's founding? Hold on to your hats, folks. Yes, even the buckle-topped ones. Because next, we're heading straight to the heart of the Wampanoag world and their side of this complicated story. Let's take a moment to shift our focus. While the Thanksgiving myth tends to spotlight the Pilgrims as the underdogs who overcame adversity, it often treats the Wampanoag people as supporting characters in someone else's story. But the Wampanoag weren't extras in a Hollywood production. They were a sophisticated, deeply rooted society with their own culture, politics, and history long before the Mayflower showed up on their shores. Picture this. It's the early 1600s, and the Wampanoag Confederacy, led by Chief Massasoit, is a major power in what we now call southeastern Massachusetts and Rhode Island. They weren't just a single tribe. They were a coalition of smaller groups, united by language and trade networks, with a population estimated at tens of thousands. These were people who had thrived in the region for generations, using advanced farming, fishing, and hunting techniques to make the most of the land's resources. But then came the Europeans, and with them came something far more devastating than guns or swords: disease. Between 1616 and 1619, just a few years before the Pilgrims' arrival, a series of epidemics, likely smallpox or leptospirosis, ravaged the Wampanoag and other native groups. Estimates suggest that as much as 90% of the native population in the region was wiped out. Entire villages disappeared, leaving fields and forests eerily empty. For the Wampanoag, this wasn't just a public health crisis, it was an existential one. So when the Pilgrims arrived in 1620, they didn't exactly land in untouched wilderness. They stepped into a world reeling from loss, where once thriving communities had been reduced to a fraction of their former size. And yet, the Wampanoag people didn't immediately see the Pilgrims as a threat. In fact, Massasoit saw an opportunity. Massasoit's decision to ally with the Pilgrims wasn't driven by charity or goodwill. It was a calculated political move. The Wampanoag were sandwiched between rival tribes like the Narragansett to the west, who had escaped the worst of the epidemics and were now a growing threat. Massasoit recognized that these strange, desperate newcomers might be useful allies, especially if they had access to European weapons and trade goods. And so, he extended a cautious hand of friendship. But let's not romanticize this. Imagine the sheer courage or desperation it must have taken for the Wampanoag to trust these pale-skinned strangers who brought so much death and disruption in their wake. And imagine the Pilgrims, starving and barely clinging to life, suddenly finding themselves dependent on a people they didn't understand and whose land they'd essentially invaded. The Wampanoag didn't just teach the Pilgrims how to farm corn or catch eels. They taught them how to survive in an environment they were completely unequipped to handle. Without Massasoit's intervention, the Pilgrims' first winter likely would have been their last. And yet, for the Wampanoag, this wasn't just about helping. It was about survival in a rapidly changing and increasingly dangerous world. So, when we think about the Thanksgiving story, we need to remember this. The Wampanoag didn't stumble into history by accident. They were active participants, making tough, strategic decisions in the face of unimaginable challenges. Their story isn't one of submission or subservience, it's one of resilience and pragmatism. Next, we'll flip the coin and look at the Pilgrims, their struggles, their desperation, and how their partnership with the Wampanoag shaped their first year in the New World. Spoiler alert, it wasn't all turkey and trimmings. If you've ever planted a garden and had every single plant die on you, you might have a faint idea of how the Pilgrims felt in 1620. These folks were not the seasoned survivalists we like to imagine. They were religious separatists from England, city folk for the most part, who found themselves in a new world they didn't understand, facing a climate they weren't prepared for, and dealing with crops they had no idea how to grow. Honestly, they probably couldn't have made it through a modern episode of Survivor, let alone a brutal Massachusetts winter. When the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth in December 1620, their first winter was, to put it lightly, a complete disaster. Half of their population died from starvation, cold, and disease. The Mayflower crew, who had planned to sail back to England, ended up sticking around just to keep the remaining settlers alive. By spring, the survivors were hanging on by the thinnest of threads, and that's when the Wampanoag, led by Massasoit, stepped in. Now here's where the myth takes a turn toward truth. Yes, the Wampanoag did help the Pilgrims, and yes, they taught them how to survive, but this wasn't some Disney montage where everyone's singing and learning to farm together. It was practical, deliberate, and frankly life-saving. Enter Tisquantum, better known to us as Squanto. Squanto's story is both fascinating and tragic. He wasn't just any Wampanoag. He had been kidnapped years earlier by English explorers, sold into slavery in Spain, and eventually made his way back to his homeland, only to find his entire village wiped out by disease. Despite everything he'd been through, Squanto decided to use his knowledge of English and European ways to help the Pilgrims. He taught them how to plant corn using fish as fertilizer, a technique that was utterly foreign to them but perfectly suited to the New England soil. He also showed them where to fish, how to harvest shellfish, and how to navigate the local terrain. But Squanto's role wasn't just about survival skills. He became a kind of middleman, a cultural translator between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag. Without him, the fragile alliance Massasoit had brokered might have collapsed before it even began. Think of Squanto as the unsung hero of this entire ordeal, someone whose personal tragedy and resilience became the literal lifeline for the Pilgrims. By the fall of 1621, the Pilgrims finally had something to celebrate. Their harvest wasn't bountiful by today's standards, but it was enough to get them through the next winter. And here's the part everyone remembers: the feast. Historians agree there probably was some kind of meal shared between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag that fall, but let's set the record straight. It wasn't a Thanksgiving in the sense we know today. There was no cranberry sauce, no pumpkin pie, and certainly no awkward family political debates over dinner. It was a harvest festival, a tradition the Pilgrims brought with them from England, and it likely included venison, corn, shellfish, and wild fowl, not the turkey dinner we romanticize. But the real story here isn't the menu. It's the fragile partnership that made the feast possible. The Wampanoag had given the Pilgrims the tools to survive, and the Pilgrims, in turn, offered something the Wampanoag valued: access to European trade goods and potential allies against their rivals. It was less a celebration of harmony and more a momentary truce, a tenuous peace born out of mutual necessity. Of course, this alliance wouldn't last. In the next section, we'll dig into how this fragile peace began to fracture and how the seeds of conflict were sown, leading to one of the bloodiest chapters in early American history. The alliance between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag wasn't built to last, and honestly, it's a miracle it held together as long as it did. From the moment the Mayflower settlers stepped off their ship, the relationship between these two groups was underpinned by mutual need rather than mutual trust. The Wampanoag needed allies against the Narragansett and other rival tribes, and the Pilgrims needed, well, everything. Food, shelter, survival tips, you name it. But as the saying goes, necessity makes strange bedfellows. For a while, things seemed to hold steady. The Pilgrims even signed a treaty of mutual protection with the Wampanoag in 1621, one which basically said, "You help us and we'll help you if the Narragansett come knocking." But this fragile peace rested on some shaky assumptions, chief among them that the Pilgrims wouldn't grow too fast or demand too much. Spoiler alert, they did both. As the years went by, more English settlers arrived, and the Pilgrims began to expand their footprint. They cleared land for farming, land that, from the Wampanoag perspective, wasn't theirs to take. The settlers also brought with them a cultural arrogance, seeing their ways as superior to those of the native people. The Wampanoag, meanwhile, were grappling with the continued effects of disease and the growing realization that these new friends might not leave anytime soon. Then there was the matter of religion. The Pilgrims weren't just settlers. They were deeply devout Puritans who believed they were on a divine mission. To them, the native peoples weren't just different. They were heathens in need of saving. This religious zeal led to efforts to convert native people to Christianity, further straining relationships. Imagine someone showing up in your home, taking your land, and then telling you your beliefs are wrong. It's not exactly a recipe for long-term friendship. By the time Massasoit died in 1661, the Wampanoag were in a precarious position. His son, Metacom, known to the English as King Philip, took over leadership of the Confederacy. Unlike his father, Metacom saw the writing on the wall. The English weren't just allies, they were colonizers, and their continued expansion threatened not only the Wampanoag's land, but their entire way of life. Tensions boiled over in 1675 when a series of violent encounters between settlers and native people sparked what's now known as King Philip's War. This was no minor skirmish. It was one of the bloodiest conflicts in American history, with devastating consequences for both sides. Entire villages were burned to the ground, crops were destroyed, and thousands of lives were lost. By the time the war ended in 1676, the Wampanoag Confederacy was shattered, and the native population of southern New England was decimated. King Philip's War marked the end of any pretense of peace between the settlers and the Wampanoag. It was the tragic culmination of years of broken promises, cultural misunderstandings, and competing visions for the future. The Pilgrims may have survived thanks to the Wampanoag's help, but their survival came at a steep cost for the people who had made it possible. And here's the bitter irony. While we celebrate Thanksgiving as a moment of harmony and gratitude, the real legacy of that first feast is a sobering reminder of how fragile peace can be and how quickly alliances can unravel when built on uneven ground. In the final segment, we'll reflect on what Thanksgiving means today. Can we honor the holiday while acknowledging its complicated history? Let's explore how we can use this story to inspire deeper understanding and maybe a little gratitude for the messy, complex past that shaped us. So here we are, almost 400 years after that famous or infamous feast, still gathering around tables every November to celebrate Thanksgiving. And while we love the turkey, stuffing, and mashed potatoes, it's worth asking, what exactly are we celebrating? Is it the sanitized version of history we were taught in school, or is it something deeper, something more honest? Let's be real. Thanksgiving has become a complicated holiday. On the one hand, it's a chance for families and friends to come together, share a meal, and express gratitude, and that's a beautiful thing. Because in a world that often feels like it's spinning out of control, taking a moment to reflect on what we're thankful for is an act of rebellion against chaos. But on the other hand, we can't ignore the truth behind the myth. The real story of Thanksgiving isn't just about gratitude and survival. It's about cultural collisions, uneasy alliances, and the devastating consequences of colonization. And while it's tempting to brush those parts under the rug, doing so robs us of the full picture. Because here's the thing, history isn't supposed to make us comfortable. It's supposed to make us think. So how do we balance these two sides of Thanksgiving? First, by acknowledging that the story is more complex than the version in our children's coloring books. We can honor the resilience and courage of both the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag without ignoring the suffering and conflict that followed. In fact, doing so gives the holiday more meaning, not less. It reminds us that even in the messiest moments of history, there are lessons to be learned about survival, cooperation, and the consequences of our actions. Second, we can use Thanksgiving as an opportunity to reflect on what gratitude really means. It's not just about being thankful for the food on our plates. It's about recognizing the sacrifices and struggles that made that meal possible. It's about understanding that the comforts we enjoy today were built on the backs of those who came before us, for better or worse. And finally, we can approach Thanksgiving with a sense of humility. The holiday doesn't belong to any one group or narrative. It's a shared story, one that's still being written. When we sit down at our tables, we can choose to see Thanksgiving not as a celebration of a perfect past, but as a chance to commit to a better future, a future where we learn from history rather than erasing it, where we strive for understanding instead of division, and where we give thanks not just for what we have, but for the opportunity to grow. So this year, as you carve the turkey, or the tofurkey if that's your thing, take a moment to think about the real story of Thanksgiving. It's not just a history lesson, it's a mirror reflecting the best and worst of who we are. And maybe, just maybe, it can inspire us to live up to the ideals we claim to celebrate. And there you have it, folks, the real story of Thanksgiving. It's not the glossy, picture-perfect tale we grew up with, but that's what makes it worth exploring. History isn't about picking sides or finding heroes and villains. It's about understanding the complexities, the struggles, and the humanity behind the stories that shape us. Thanksgiving is a reminder of that, if we're willing to look a little deeper. If you enjoyed today's episode and learned something new, or if I at least gave you a good excuse to fact-check your uncle at the dinner table this year, do me a favor, like, share, and review Seeds of History. Your support helps us keep planting those historical seeds, one episode at a time. And hey, while you're at it, tell a friend. Share this episode with someone who loves history, or even someone who claims they hate it. Who knows? Maybe they'll come around once they hear the real story of Thanksgiving. Thank you for spending this time with me. I'm Bennett Tanton, and this has been Seeds of History. Until next time, keep digging, keep questioning, and keep growing. Happy Thanksgiving, everyone.